My name is Miller Files, and for most of my life, I have walked in the footprints of men who thought they could outsmart a nation. Men who believed they could bend fear into a weapon and let it drift unnoticed through the cracks of society. Men who hid behind anonymity, silence, and distance. But among all the criminals I have pursued, there is one who stands apart like a cold landmark in the history of American crime, a man who did not need crowds, accomplices, or gunfire. He only needed a box, a stamp, and an idea shaped dangerously inside a brilliant but twisted mind. The world would eventually call him the Unabomber, but long before that name appeared in newspaper headlines, long before his shadow stretched across university halls and airline terminals, everything began quietly, almost unremarkably, with a single package no bigger than a lunchbox. And that package would become the opening page of a 17-year hunt, a hunt that challenged science, patience, and the very structure of federal investigation. This is the story I am about to tell you. A story of fear hidden inside ordinary objects. A story of a criminal more patient than anyone realized. A story of a nation learning that terror doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it arrives inside a cardboard box left on a table. On May 25th, 1978, the first explosion ripped open not only a package, but the quiet assumptions of American life. It happened in a corridor at Northwestern University, Illinois. A security officer picked up a parcel that someone said had been found in a parking lot. It was addressed to a professor, but something felt off. The return address didn't seem familiar. The handwriting looked shaky and deliberate, almost as if the sender wanted it to appear normal, but couldn't quite hide the heavy mechanical pressure of the pen. The officer decided to open it, thinking he was helping return misplaced mail. The package struck like a silent animal waking up. A sudden burst of sharp heat splintered wood, smoke, and metal. Miraculously, the officer survived, but the package had done its job. It had drawn a line from anonymity to reality. A line investigators such as myself would chase for nearly 2 decades. At first, the blast didn't fit a pattern. Universities had seen threats before, usually from disgruntled students or political activists. But nothing about this device resembled the chaotic effort of an amateur. The bomb was handmade, yes, but it was crafted with a sense of intentionality, almost like someone wanted it to look crude, so investigators wouldn't suspect real expertise. The wood casing was cut meticulously. The blasting cap was assembled from parts that could be purchased anywhere in the country. There were no fingerprints, no hair fibers, no DNA, nothing organic left behind. Every surface had been washed or scorched clean. This wasn't the work of a hot-headed teenager. This was the work of someone who understood that anonymity wasn't just a shield, it was a strategy. 7 months later, in May 1979, danger took flight. Quite literally, an explosive device was discovered in the cargo hold of American Airlines, Flight 444. The bomb malfunctioned not for lack of skill, but because the cabin pressure changed the ignition in a way the bomber did not expect. Heat and smoke flooded part of the plane, forcing the pilots into an emergency landing. If everything had worked the way the builder intended, more than 70 passengers might have died that day. That was when the FBI's internal designation UNABOM was coined, short for University and Airline Bomber. At that moment, although no one knew his face, no one doubted the presence of a calculated, evolving threat. When I read the early case files years later, what struck me most was not the blasts themselves, but the silence. The bomber never called the police, never issued a warning, never sent a manifesto, never demanded anything. He simply acted, watched the aftermath through newspapers, and built the next device with cold adjustment. Each bomb was a lesson. Each mistake was a stepping stone toward refinement. He was not trying to shock the world. He was trying to shape it through fear, but slowly, deliberately. Like a sculptor carving a statue, one hidden cut at a time. By 1980, investigators across multiple states began seeing a strange signature. Several components inside the bombs were stamped with initials made of metal strips, welded crudely but intentionally. They did not give a name, but they gave something more dangerous a consistency. Bomb after bomb contained these odd metallic imprints. They were not decorative. They were not random. They were a psychological fingerprint. The bomber's way of saying, "I am here and I am paying attention." Back then, forensic science was not what it is today. DNA databases were non-existent. Fingerprinting relied on smudges and luck. Behavioral profiling was in its infancy. That meant the bomber operated in a frontier of opportunity. He was rare, invisible, disciplined. And as the years went on, one thing became clear to those of us who followed the case. The Unabomber didn't fear time. He embraced it. The early 1980s were marked by brief lulls, then sudden strikes. A few months with nothing, then another package, another explosion, another victim. The FBI struggled to build a coherent profile. They wondered if multiple perpetrators were involved. They questioned whether the bomber had ties to political groups. They debated whether the attacks were symbolic or random. But each bomb told a different story. Materials changed. Triggers changed. The bomber experimented with barbed wire, battery types, metal shrapnel, wooden triggers, pressure switches. He studied his failures. He studied the FBI studying him. To the public, the attacks were frightening, but seemed distant, isolated. Most people outside academia barely noticed. But within certain communities' engineering departments, airline companies, universities, the fear was growing quietly, like mold in the walls. Professors examined their mail twice before opening it. Airline employees whispered during breaks. Security officers changed procedures. But the bomber knew something society hadn't realized yet. Fear doesn't need to be loud to take root. It just needs to be unpredictable. And unpredictability was his favorite tool. In late 1981, and early 1982, agents uncovered something chilling. Several bombs included bits of debris deliberately placed inside them, charred splinters from a tree, pieces of rubber, stray wires that served no purpose. At first, these items seemed like trash from the bomber's workshop, but months later, analysts realized the truth. These physical fragments were not trash. They were decoys, meant to mislead investigators toward false conclusions. Every wrong assumption they followed gave him more time. Every dead end was a victory. He wasn't just building bombs. He was building confusion. Some criminals thrive on chaos. The Unabomber thrived on precision. He did not want random violence. He wanted targeted disruption. And in those early years, his targets always had something in common. They were people who represented what he hated: technological advancement, industrial expansion, academic influence. His bombs were not just weapons. They were messages without words. What I find chilling even now is that during these years, while experts and agents scrambled for answers, Ted Kaczynski, though we did not know his name yet, sat alone in a small cabin in Montana, a cabin without electricity, heating, or plumbing. He chopped firewood or vegetables, hunted rabbits, and wrote in journals lit only by kerosene lamps. To the outside world, he was a recluse. But in reality, he was sharpening his ideology. He believed modern society was enslaving human beings. He believed technology was destroying freedom, and he believed violence was the only way to reverse the tide. Yet none of us knew that then. All we saw was the smoke left behind. As the 1980s moved forward, the Unabomber's attacks became less about the individual victims and more about the message. But that message was still hidden, encoded in fragments of metal and wood. To understand the mind behind the bombs, we had to interpret the silence, the craftsmanship, the intervals of time. That was the hardest part. Most criminals either escalate quickly or collapse under their own chaos. The Unabomber escalated slowly, like a glacier grinding forward, unstoppable and patient. The first years of the case built the foundation of what was to come. They established the bomber's rhythm, his obsession with anonymity, his mechanical intelligence, his deep hatred toward institutions that represented progress. And while the public only saw a handful of news reports, the FBI already understood this was not a temporary threat. This was a long war. For me, rereading those early case files feels like watching the first few minutes of a horror film where the audience doesn't yet know the monster's shape. But it is lurking, growing, learning. In 1978 and 1979, America didn't know what it was facing. But by 1980, one truth began to solidify. This was only the beginning, and like all beginnings, it carried the weight of a storm building far beyond the horizon. This concludes Part 1, the first shadow cast by a man who believed he could reshape the world with explosives. In the next chapter, the storm begins to take form. This is Miller Files, returning to the long shadow of a man who believed he could rewrite the world with explosives. In Part 1, we walked through the earliest tremors of a storm that would haunt America for nearly 2 decades. Now, as we step into the mid-1980s, that storm begins to evolve. It becomes sharper, colder, more strategic. The bombs grow deadlier, the patterns more complex, and the silence surrounding each attack becomes a suffocating kind of pressure that grips investigators and victims alike. By 1983, 5 years into the Unabomber's campaign, there was already a strange rhythm to the chaos. Months of quiet, then a sudden blast, a lull, followed by a new package, a new injury, a new scar on the map. Each attack was a punctuation mark in a phrase we still couldn't understand. And like a language no one had ever been taught, we struggled to read the grammar of violence the bomber was constructing. One of the earliest insights we had into his evolving technique came from the materials recovered at the scenes. I've held those fragments in my hands when the cases were old and dusty, when the country had moved on, but we investigators had not. The devices were no longer crude wooden boxes. They were increasingly complex systems of switches, wires, and shrapnel crafted from scavenged parts that looked ordinary but had been transformed into lethal mechanisms. The bomber was adapting, learning, refining. He was treating each device as both a weapon and an experiment. But what terrified us most was not the physical refinement. It was the psychological refinement. The bomb started to include new elements of false leads, misdirection, little hints that felt like breadcrumbs. Some items seemed intentionally included to confuse investigators. A piece of a glove, a bit of wire that didn't connect to anything, a structural flaw that seemed like a mistake but was repeated in several devices. These touches were like the bomber whispering over our shoulders, playing with us, shaping our assumptions. Then came 1985. If the early years were the murmur of a rising threat, 1985 was the year the Unabomber's voice became clear, deadly, and unmistakable. That was the year he killed for the first time. His 7th known bomb exploded outside a computer store in Sacramento, California. The victim, Hugh Scruton, never stood a chance. The device was placed on the ground, no delivery, no packaging, no disguise as a piece of mail. It was planted, waiting like a predator crouched in tall grass. Scruton bent down to move what looked like a block of wood, and that was all it took. The autopsy report described hundreds of wooden and metal fragments embedded in his body. The bomb was designed not just to kill, but to obliterate. When investigators dug through the debris, they found something chilling: new mechanical systems inside the device, an improved trigger, a reinforced casing, and the same mysterious signature elements that appeared in earlier bombs. This was no longer a bomber trying to avoid detection. This was a bomber escalating. I remember reading that file and feeling a strange, hollow certainty. The Unabomber had crossed a psychological threshold. He had tasted the power of ending a life and found it effective, purposeful. Meaningful to his mission, investigators scrambled. The FBI built one of the largest task forces in its history. Behavioral analysts combed through every scrap of evidence. Public announcements warned professors and researchers to be cautious with their mail, but the bomber stayed silent, watching as the nation groped blindly. Later that year, another bomb injured a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. His hands and face were torn apart, but he survived. The device was small, almost delicate in appearance, but its internal structure showed a chilling precision. It had been placed among shelves of academic journals, as if the bomber wanted to attack not just the individual, but the very idea of intellectual pursuit. Then came another attack, this time against a psychology professor at the same university. He opened a package in his office. The explosion shattered windows and sent shrapnel across the room. He escaped with his life, but only barely. These attacks made something very clear. The Unabomber was not choosing targets at random. He was selecting people who represented something larger than themselves: academics, scientists, engineers, technologists, and later corporate leaders connected to technological innovation. His enemy wasn't the individuals he injured. It was the world they stood for. But at this stage, we still didn't know why. We still didn't understand the ideology that drove him. All we had were explosions, fragments, and silence. Around 1986, a subtle but important shift occurred. The bombs began to include pieces of a common item: nails, rusty nails, bent and sharpened, embedded in resin or epoxy. They were designed to maximize injury, to turn the explosions into storms of shredding metal. Some nails were coated with substances to obscure their origin. Others were hand-modified, shaped into jagged pieces that tore through flesh like miniature blades. To anyone else, these details sound monstrous. To those of us who investigated the case, they were worse. They were signs of a mind at work, a mind thinking, improving, testing. Time became the Unabomber's greatest weapon. He was not in a hurry. He could build a device for months. He could wait for the perfect target. He could disappear through the cracks of society because he lived outside the structures most people depended on. Off the grid, alone, untraceable. By 1987, the FBI believed the Unabomber might be living far from urban centers. That suspicion came from the rhythm of his attacks and the rare sightings of a strange man seen near one of the bombing sites that year. A hooded figure, carrying a bag, walking through a parking lot moments before a package was discovered. The witness descriptions were vague: dark jacket, sunglasses, possibly a mustache. But the image would become iconic later, reproduced in composite sketches across newspapers and post offices nationwide. That same year, the bomber attempted to kill the president of United Airlines with a mailed bomb. It never reached its target. Postal inspectors intercepted it after noticing it had no proper return address. That was one of the rare times fortune leaned our way. But the device itself was another step forward in sophistication. More stable ignition systems, improved wiring, reinforced casing, more lethal shrapnel. The Unabomber wasn't slowing down. He was preparing for something bigger. I often think about those years, the middle of his reign of terror, as the years of sharpening. He was sharpening his weapons, his methods, his philosophy, and his hatred. In those years, Ted Kaczynski, the man no one yet knew, was sitting in his remote cabin in Montana writing notes, testing chemicals, shaping pieces of wood and metal, building bombs with hands trained in mathematical precision. We didn't know it at the time, but he was also writing pages of what would later become his manifesto, the ideological core of his violence. Every line he wrote in that shack was part of a growing belief system that justified, in his mind, the destruction he unleashed. And all the while, the country thought maybe the attacks had slowed. Maybe the bomber had vanished. Maybe the threat was fading. But it wasn't fading. It was condensing, distilling, becoming something sharper. By the late 1980s, most Americans had forgotten the first few bombings, lost in the noise of politics and culture. But those who lived in the fields of academia and technology felt a cold awareness settle into their daily routines. A professor would pause before opening a package. A lab technician would hesitate when picking up a box. A dean would check with his assistant twice before signing for a delivery. Fear had become a background hum across the entire institution. Unabomber had not needed to kill hundreds. He had created an atmosphere, a psychological fog that blurred the edges of normalcy. And for us investigators, the pattern remained agonizingly incomplete. The materials were ordinary. The methods varied. The intervals were inconsistent. Profilers debated whether he was a failed academic, a survivalist, a mentally unstable genius, or even part of a group. Every theory seemed possible. None seemed certain. But in hindsight, the truth was simple. The Unabomber was building toward something larger than single attacks, something bigger than the wounds and deaths he caused. He wanted a stage, a platform, a way to show the world his reasoning, his ideology, his justification, and in the years ahead, he would reveal exactly that. But before the manifesto came the blood, before the justification came the bodies, before the words came the explosions, and before the world understood what was happening, the Unabomber would strike again stronger, louder, and deadlier. This is where Part 2 ends. The evolution of terror is underway, and the next stage will bring the investigation into its most chaotic, desperate years. The bombs will become more lethal, the attacks more brazen, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the Unabomber will make a mistake that reveals a fragment of his identity. A fragment just large enough to change everything. This is Miller Files, returning to the most suffocating stretch of the Unabomber case. If the first years of his campaign were the rising tremors of a distant threat, the years between 1988 and 1994 were a long, heavy silence broken only by moments of devastation so precise, so intentional, they felt almost surgical. This was the era when the bomber's mask seemed impenetrable, when investigators felt they were chasing a ghost with infinite patience. But it was also the era when something crucial happened. A crack appeared. Small, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Yet that crack would eventually split open the entire fatih he had built. When 1988 began, the FBI task force was exhausted. The case had consumed thousands of hours of manpower, countless meetings, and endless analysis. Every fragment of every bomb had been examined under microscopes, scanned, cataloged, compared. Every letter that passed through academic departments was watched with nervous anticipation. And yet, despite the massive effort, we were no closer to understanding who the bomber was than we had been 10 years earlier. By this point, the Unabomber had mastered a particular rhythm: long periods of inactivity followed by sudden, brutal violence. He understood human psychology well enough to know that long silences create complacency. People relax, security protocols loosen, mailrooms grow careless. Investigators shift resources to newer, fresher cases. In those gaps, he found opportunity, and in 1988, he struck again. The bomb was mailed to a professor specializing in computer science. It detonated when the package was opened, tearing through the victim's hands and chest. Shrapnel lodged itself in the walls, embedding tiny metallic signatures that we investigators recognized immediately. The same pattern, the same craftsmanship, the same eerie blend of simplicity and genius, but something else was evolving. The tone of the devices was changing, less experimental, more confident. It was as if the bomber had found his style and was refining it into something streamlined and efficient. One thing that began to emerge during this period was a behavioral pattern we had missed earlier. Whenever the bomber went silent for more than a year, the next attack usually targeted someone with a connection to technology or industry. We couldn't yet articulate why that mattered, but it mattered. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on investigators was starting to show. The task force had become a revolving door. Agents were reassigned. New analysts replaced the old. Case leaders burned out. Some developed near obsessive attachments to the case, unable to let it go even after being pulled away. The Unabomber wasn't just attacking institutions, he was eroding the people chasing him. Then came 1993, the year the case pivoted. 2 bombs were mailed within weeks of each other. The first targeted a geneticist. The second targeted a computer scientist. Both men survived, but barely. In each incident, the bombs were disguised as mail items wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed with string, with a return address that pointed to a non-existent sender. But the bombs themselves revealed something new: handwritten labels. Up to this point, the Unabomber had avoided handwriting whenever possible. He preferred printed labels, typewritten materials, anything that reduced traceability. But in these 2 bombs, the labels were handwritten carefully, almost artistically, letters formed by someone who had spent a lot of time alone, practicing penmanship as a skill, a habit, or perhaps even a compulsion. Handwriting analysts noticed unusual spacing. Certain letters, like the A and the T, were written with severe angular strokes, suggestive of someone who favored mechanical rigidity over natural flow. This wasn't enough for identification, not even close, but it was new. And with a case this starved for leads, new mattered. After the second bombing that year, something else happened. Something almost no one outside the investigation immediately recognized as important. The bomber sent a letter. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even overtly threatening. It was cautious, structured, a kind of test message, a way to see whether communication with the outside world could offer him leverage. The letter was mailed to a professor who had recently been injured in one of the bombings. It contained cryptic statements about industrial society, the erosion of human autonomy, and technological enslavement. It was the first window into his mind, the first moment when he stepped out from behind pure violence and revealed that he believed his actions had a philosophical purpose. Investigators were stunned. For years, we had been operating under the assumption that the Unabomber was either apolitical or driven purely by personal grudges. But the tone of the letter was different, detached, intellectual, like someone who wanted to lecture rather than rage. This was the moment when the Behavioral Sciences Unit began building what would later become one of the most accurate criminal profiles in FBI history. They described the Unabomber as an intelligent but socially isolated white male, likely with advanced technical education, harboring deep resentment toward modern society. They believed he lived in a rural area. They believed he had minimal social contact. They believed he saw himself as superior to the world he hated. The profile was close, very close, but at the time, it felt too broad to be actionable. Thousands of people fit those criteria, tens of thousands. So the case remained frozen. We had more insight but no face, more understanding but no name. Then, in 1994, the Unabomber killed again. His bomb arrived at the home of a public relations executive named Thomas Mosser. When Mosser opened the package, the explosion tore through him instantly. He died before he could even fall to the ground. The device was powerful, stable, and efficient, every inch of it crafted by someone who had reached the peak of his deadly craft. This bombing marked an evolution in motive. Mosser represented something different. Not academia, not engineering, but communication, mass messaging, media influence. His work directly intersected with corporations that shaped public opinion. To the Unabomber, that likely made him part of the machine he despised. The letter claiming responsibility arrived shortly after. It was longer, angrier, more ideological. The bomber criticized the victim's role in the technological system. He framed the murder as a necessary act within a larger ideological war. This was the first time he explicitly connected his violence to a worldview. The first time he expressed the intention not just to hurt, but to teach, or at least to justify himself. And yet, even with this new glimpse into his mind, he remained invisible. No fingerprints, no traceable materials, no witnesses, no digital footprint, no financial transactions. For all practical purposes, the Unabomber did not exist. He lived in silence, thought in silence, killed in silence. But the mask had cracked, not in a dramatic way, not through a careless mistake. The crack appeared through language, through structure, through syntax, through the way he framed his ideas, through the rhythm of his sentences, through the meticulous precision of every phrase. We didn't know it yet, but the words he wrote in 1993 and 1994 would later become the most important evidence in the entire case. The end of 1994 brought a chilling realization. After nearly 17 years, the Unabomber was no longer just a bomber. He was preparing to become something else, an ideologue, a writer, a messenger, someone who believed the world needed to hear him. The violence wasn't ending. It was transforming, escalating into a new phase. In the next part of this documentary, you will see how language, something intangible, something invisible, became the key that finally exposed the man who thought he could remain hidden forever. But for now, remember this: every monster eventually speaks. And when the Unabomber spoke, even in fragments, even in small letters, he revealed more than he ever intended. This is Miller File, returning to the moment when the Unabomber finally stepped out of complete silence, not by revealing his face, not by being caught on camera, not by leaving a fingerprint, but by doing something far more human and far more dangerous. He wrote, 1995 was the turning point in one of the longest and most haunting criminal manhunts in American history. For nearly 17 years, the Unabomber had lived like a ghost. He had spoken only through explosions, communicated only through fragments of metal and wood. But suddenly, in the spring of 1995, the ghost found a voice, and that voice came in the form of a 35,000-word manifesto that would shake the foundations of law enforcement, journalism, and public safety. It began with a letter sent to the New York Times and the Washington Post, a letter that did not threaten immediate violence, did not rant incoherently, but instead laid out a chilling proposition. The Unabomber demanded that the newspapers publish his manifesto. If they agreed, he claimed, he would stop killing. If they refused, he implied, more blood would be spilled. The letter was structured with unnerving clarity, not frantic, not unstable, calm, cold, logical, and that tone was what terrified us most. It was the tone of someone who believed deeply in his cause, someone who saw murder not as chaos, but as strategy. I remember reading the first analysis of that letter. The room felt heavy, thick with the realization that the bomber had just changed the rules of engagement. For years, we had been hunting a phantom. Now, the phantom wanted to talk. FBI leadership debated endlessly. Publishing the manifesto could encourage other extremists. It could give a murderer exactly what he wanted, a platform. But refusing could trigger another bomb, another death, another scar on the national psyche. And there was something else, hidden beneath the moral debate, something we investigators understood instinctively. Words can betray a man in ways bombs never can. The possibility that the manifesto might reveal linguistic traces, patterns, habits, philosophies, that potential haunted every discussion behind closed doors. Ultimately, the leadership decided that the manifesto must be published, not to appease the bomber, not because he demanded it, but because giving the public access to his writing meant millions of eyes would read it. And somewhere among those millions, perhaps one pair of eyes would recognize the voice behind the words. On September 19, 1995, the manifesto appeared in both newspapers. Its title was Industrial Society and Its Future, a sprawling treatise arguing that modern technology was destroying human freedom. It criticized everything from industrial agriculture to psychological manipulation in mass media. It railed against political ideology, capitalism, socialism, leftists, conservatives, everyone. To the Unabomber, the only true enemy was the technological system itself. I read all 35 words slowly, carefully, because as investigators, we knew the bomb spoke to his methods, but the manifesto spoke to his mind, and his mind was a labyrinth. The writing was obsessive, precise, filled with academic structure and philosophical references. But beneath the logic, there was bitterness, an unmistakable resentment toward universities, scholarly elites, and technological innovators. Every paragraph pulsed with hatred of institutions that he believed had ruined humanity. His hatred was not personal, it was ideological. Yet, ironically, the strength of this ideology was exactly what cracked his mask. For the first time, we could compare ideas, syntax, word choice, structure, tone. For the first time, we had not just fragments of steel, but fragments of thought. While the country debated whether the manifesto was dangerous, insane, or strangely compelling, the FBI was focused on something far more subtle. Linguistic analysts began dissecting the manifesto like a disassembled bomb. They looked for repeated phrases, idiosyncratic spelling, unique constructions, word pairs, unusual transitions, rhetorical habits, everything. We found patterns. Patterns that no two writers share by coincidence. Little did we know, at that same time, a man in upstate New York was reading the manifesto with a growing sense of dread. His name was David Kaczynski, and the voice in the manifesto sounded too familiar. But before his revelation would reach us, the case took another deadly turn. Just a few months before the manifesto's publication, the Unabomber had killed again. His victim this time was Gilbert Murray, a lobbyist for the timber industry. The bomb was powerful enough to rip apart the office entryway, where Murray opened the package. The message behind the attack was clear. The bomber was expanding his targets. Not just academics, not just scientists, but industry leaders, people connected to environmental policy, people he believed were contributing to the destruction of nature. To investigators like me, this escalation meant something profound. He wasn't killing randomly. His targets were carefully selected based on ideology. And ideology is always personal. But now, with the publication of the manifesto, we saw that ideology spelled out, written plainly. The hatred we had inferred for years was now visible in black ink. And with visibility came vulnerability. In the weeks after publication, thousands of calls flooded the FBI tip lines. Most were useless, some were bizarre, a few were cruel hoaxes. But one call stood out, a quiet, hesitant voice, a man who said he recognized the writing style, the tone. The worldview. He told agents that his brother, Theodore Kaczynski, had written essays that sounded eerily similar. He mentioned that Ted had once lived a promising academic life before retreating into isolation, that he distrusted modern society, that he wrote relentlessly, and that his letters had the same unusual phrasing as the manifesto. Some investigators thought it was a coincidence. Others thought it was the break we had been waiting for. I fell into the second group, because, in my experience, writing is like a fingerprint of the mind, and once you've seen a fingerprint, you can never unsee it. When David gave us old letters written by Ted, the comparison was immediate, striking, unmistakable. The same unusual phrases, the same tone of philosophical superiority, the same bitterness toward technology and progress, the same rhetorical patterns. Ted Kaczynski might not have left fingerprints on his bombs, but he had left them all over his words. By December 1995, the case had finally shifted. After nearly 2 decades, we had a living, breathing suspect, someone with a past, a family, a history, a man who had walked halls, spoken to people, written letters, someone who could be tracked. Yet even with this major breakthrough, the danger was far from over. We needed evidence, real evidence, enough to justify a search warrant, enough to confront a man who had demonstrated deadly technical skill. We learned that Ted was living alone in a shack in the Montana wilderness. No electricity, no plumbing, barely any human contact, just a one-room cabin, stuffed with books, tools, and isolation. As we prepared the warrant request, we knew one thing with absolute clarity. If Ted Kaczynski was the Unabomber, then inside that cabin would be the final answers, bomb components, diagrams, journals, everything. But we were also painfully aware of something else. If he suspected we were coming, he could destroy everything, evidence, journals, supplies, even himself. This was not a suspect we could approach casually. This was a man who spent his life building bombs that were triggered by pressure, motion, temperature, and sound. A man who could turn a scrap of wood and a nail into a deadly device. A man who might booby-trap his entire property. So we waited. We watched, we gathered every detail, and as winter deepened across the Montana mountains, we prepared for the endgame. The manifesto had cracked the mask, but the mask was still there, barely holding on. And in the next chapter, that mask would shatter completely. This is where Part 4 ends. The Unabomber has spoken, and through his words, he has revealed the flaw he never believed he possessed, the inability to hide his mind, which, in the end, is how we would catch him. This is Miller Files, and after nearly 2 decades of following the shadow of the Unabomber, we finally arrive at the end. Not the end of fear, not the end of consequences, but the end of the chase. The end of a ghost story that turned out not to be a ghost at all, but a man with a mind sharp enough to build bombs and a soul dark enough to justify using them. When 1996 dawned, law enforcement had reached a point it had never reached in the Unabomber case before. Certainty of a name, certainty of a location, certainty that the writing, the ideology, the voice behind the manifesto belonged to Theodore John Kaczynski. But certainty did not mean safety. We knew where he lived, but we did not know what traps he had built. We knew who he was, but we did not know how far he would go if cornered. His cabin deep in the Montana wilderness became the focal point of our universe, a 16 by 12-foot shack, hand-built, isolated on a patch of land, surrounded by pine trees and silence. No electricity, no plumbing, no running water. A place stripped of everything except ideas, anger, and tools. To reach that cabin, agents had to traverse narrow, icy roads that curled through the mountains. Snow draped the landscape like a burial shroud. Every step toward the cabin felt like entering the interior of the Unabomber's mind, cold, unforgiving, and untouched by the world he despised. We moved slowly, deliberately, waiting for the right moment. The search warrant was approved on April 3, 1996, but approval was only the beginning. The operation required precision, no rushing, no panic. The risk was too high. Kaczynski was a master of triggers, pressure, tension, heat, motion. His property could have been a minefield. FBI teams spent days conducting surveillance. They watched Kaczynski's patterns when he left the cabin, when he gathered wood, when he checked his trap lines, when he stepped outside to wash or cook. We studied his rhythms not because we feared confrontation, but because we feared the devices we couldn't see. The morning of the arrest was brutally quiet. No helicopters, no shouting, no chaos, just quiet professionals stepping through the snow, spreading out around the cabin, closing the ring slowly. The goal was to take him alive, and to do so without triggering anything that could endanger the agents or destroy evidence. When the door finally opened, it didn't open with a crash. It opened with confusion. Kaczynski stepped out, blinking at the sight of armed agents. His beard was long, tangled, streaked with gray. His clothes were ragged from years of wilderness living. He looked like a hermit from another century, not the most dangerous domestic terrorist in modern American history. But in his eyes, there was recognition. He knew exactly why we were there. He knew the chase was over. He did not fight. He did not scream. He did not run. He simply watched as his hands were bound as agents read him his rights, as the winter air swirled around him like a final echo of the world he had chosen to reject. Then came the search. The inside of the cabin was not chaotic. It was disturbingly organized. Shelves lined with jars containing chemicals. Boxes filled with wires, nails, and metal scraps. Tools arranged with surgical precision. Stacks of notebooks, thousands of pages of handwritten thoughts, formulas, plans. There were bomb components in various stages of completion. Trigger mechanisms, hand-carved wooden boxes, metal shrapnel sorted by size. It was a bomb maker's workshop frozen in time, a laboratory of destruction disguised as a minimalist life. Then we found the journals, page after page, written in tight script, detailed his experiments, his successes, his failures, his reasoning. He wrote about each bombing as if it were a mathematical equation, variables, outcomes, improvements. He referred to his victims not as people but as targets. He described the purpose of his violence with a dispassionate tone, almost academic in its coldness. And then, deeper in the stacks, we found drafts of the manifesto, early versions, edits, rewritten paragraphs, notes in the margins, corrections. The mind that had crafted the document that changed the course of the investigation had lived here, in this silent cabin, sharpening its philosophy in the dark. The evidence was overwhelming, not just enough to link Kaczynski to the bombings, but enough to trace nearly every device he had ever built. The case was airtight, but something happened next that surprised even seasoned investigators like me. Kaczynski wanted to defend himself. He wanted to act as his own attorney. He insisted he wasn't insane. He insisted he had acted with rational intent. He insisted he could argue the morality of his crimes. When the court attempted to evaluate his mental state, he fought back, not because he feared being declared incompetent, but because he wanted to be seen as fully responsible, fully conscious, fully deliberate. He wanted the world to believe that he chose his actions with clarity. In a sense, he wanted to win the philosophical argument, even if he lost his freedom. But his legal strategy collapsed when he realized that his attorneys might use an insanity defense against his will. In a moment of desperation, he attempted suicide in his cell. The attempt failed. It showed what he feared most: not death, not prison, but being labeled mentally ill. That label to him would invalidate everything he had ever written or done. Ultimately, to avoid the possibility of being deemed incompetent, Kaczynski accepted a plea deal in 1998. He pled guilty to all charges and received 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The most prolific domestic bomber in American history would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. For many, the arrest marked closure, the end of fear, the end of the word Unabomber appearing in headlines. But inside the investigative world, it marked something different. The realization that the greatest victory did not come from explosives or traps or surveillance. It came from language. His downfall was not a fingerprint, not a witness, not a misfired bomb. His downfall was his manifesto. A document he believed would change the world became the very thing that exposed him. His ego, his need to be understood, to be heard, to explain himself, undid decades of careful anonymity. In the years that followed, Kaczynski sat in prison, writing letters, engaging in academic correspondence, arguing philosophical points. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who tried to destroy technology became a subject of fascination for the very intellectual institutions he despised. And then, in 2023, at the age of 81, Theodore John Kaczynski was found dead in his prison cell. His life ended the way he had lived it, in silence. But the shadow he cast remains. The Unabomber case rewrote the rules of criminal investigation. It pushed forensic linguistics to the forefront. It taught investigators that ideas can be evidence, that ideology leaves footprints, that even the most disciplined mind reveals itself through language. For me, this case will always be a reminder of one truth. Monsters are rarely supernatural. They are human, and their blindness, Their arrogance, their certainty, they are the cracks that let the light in.